Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we are going to be covering game number 3 of my 6th tournament. And this was game number 18 overall. And I was playing with the white pieces. And this was the final game of the day. We played 3 games this day, so the last 2 videos were all in the same day as this one as well. Now let's see how this game progresses. Since I'm playing with the white pieces, of course, I play e4. This should be expected by now. e5, and we already know what I'm going to do. Knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. Here we see knight to f6, which is a little change of pace. Normally, we have seen a6. So, what's the difference between a6 and knight to f6? Well, knight to f6 is quite obvious with its intentions. Its intentions are to take e4. And this is exactly what my opponent does after I castle. Knight takes e4. Now, I was actually quite happy to see this because I was becoming a bit of a fan of the endgame. And although I have made mistakes in the past in the endgame, I definitely learned a lot and I was excited. And if you're knowing what I'm talking about right now, there is a way to pretty much force an endgame in this position. And that's with the move d4. How does that force an endgame? Okay, the way this forces an endgame, well, let's just look quickly. It's unreasonable to take because there's always moves like rook to e1, and if you have to play d5, knight takes d4, I'm attacking c6, I'm threatening f3, black is already losing material. So this is not a good position for black. However, it's not the thing that's forced for them, so they don't have to take, even though this looks like a pawn sacrifice. Same thing with if takes, then there's just knight takes, and after pawn takes, rook e1, where you have to defend the piece now, so d5 or f5, it doesn't matter, but either way, f3 is going to happen, and white is going to be winning material again. So it is a bit of a complex line, but the normal move here is knight to d6. And how does this force an endgame? Well, you forcefully take on c6, so they have to capture back. You can take with the b pawn, this is reasonable. However, theory states that this a pawn can become just a weakness because it's just all by itself and there are no pawns to protect it. So this isn't so great. Instead, taking with the d pawn opens up your bishop as well, even though b takes does open up your bishop as well, but there's no weaknesses here for black. And after pawn takes on c6, we take on e5. Knight to f5 is the most popular move, and queen takes d8, king takes d8. So what has happened here? We have transitioned to an endgame on move 8, and some people might already be bored because this was played a lot at the top level, and well, people are kind of sick of it. However, at the time, I wasn't, and I honestly still am not. This is still a fascinating position to me because I'm not at the level where this is just a draw every time, and we'll see that in the game as well. Now here, white has advantages and black has advantages. First, white has castled, white's king is safe. However, black has the bishop pair and a pretty strong knight on f5 right now. Another thing for white, we have the pawn structures undamaged, whereas black's pawns, as we see here, are damaged. There are double pawns. Why is this important? Well, when we look at this side of the board, the king side, we can see that since our pawns are undamaged, we can forcefully create a pass pawn with f4, f5, and e6. Now this is a very long-term plan, but we do have that plan. However, black cannot forcefully make a passed pawn on the other side of the board, which means in a strategic sense we have a slight advantage. However, this is very difficult to prove and pretty much unprovable in this position theoretically at the top level. Now let's go about the game. I played knight c3, one of many moves. There's so many moves here. There's rook to d1, there's b3, there's a4, there's bishop to g5, there's bishop to f4, and I believe there's even b3. So I think I already said b3, but yeah, there's even h3 as well. So there's so many moves that white can play, and same for black. There's a lot of ideas, and this is very strategically rich. So I played knight c3, just a normal developing move. Bishop to b4. Now here, I should probably just give a check force the king to move either bishop d7 or let's say king e8, and then just move my knight away. Instead, I go for something a little unorthodox that is not so great. Now, my intention here, after a3, was if bishop takes, my argument is, okay, you no longer have the bishop pair, and I have more control over the d file, because now the c3 pawn is controlling d4, and the c2 pawn is controlling d3. This is true. However, this does not make up for the disadvantages I just obtained, where these pawns are now extremely weak. The c file, c5 and c4 specifically, are very weak squares. You can see bishop to e6, they're already controlling that square once. And if they can route their knight there somehow, then this is a very strong place for their pieces to go. And that is why it is quite a big downside. And you can see that in some lines, well, they can just be taken. And maybe not immediately, but long term, this is not such a great thing. And although it was a damaged structure, I was trying to argue that it did control d4. However, luckily, my opponent did not go for it and played bishop to a5 instead. Even though I think that bishop takes c3 is the best choice, giving up the bishop pair, because you get a permanent weakness to attack. And another thing I would actually like to mention here, I do not have a weakness I can attack. My advantage versus them having a double pawns on this side of the board was that they couldn't force a passed pawn. However, now I have a weakness on the same side of the board. So the advantage of having an undamaged structure on the king side won't matter as much. Let's continue. Bishop to a5, b4, so I didn't want to allow any knight takes or bishop takes on c3 anymore. Bishop to b6 and knight to a4. And I'm actually going to say this is also not the right idea. It makes sense, it really does. I'm trying to get rid of the bishop pair. However, this is going to sound very weird, especially if you know my playstyle. This is not the right call. Going for the bishop is not the right call. And although you get rid of their bishop pair, you get to improve their structure, and it's just uncomfortable for you, and you're getting rid of one of their problem pieces in the position. And instead, you should just be focusing on development, say knight e4, bishop b2, and rook a to d1. Examples like that. It doesn't have to be those exact movements, but those are just ideas in the position. Now, knight to a4, okay, going for the bishop pair. It makes a lot of sense, although it's a very, very concrete and easy thing to mess up on. I try to get the bishop pair when I shouldn't have, or try to remove their bishop pair when I shouldn't have. But okay, bishop e6, knight takes b6, and c takes b6. Bishop to g5 check, king to c7. I also have been known to play bishop to f4, not on this move, but all the way back. If we go instead knight to c3, I have played bishop to f4 quite a bit in this position, as that is a line I'm actually quite a big fan of. Something that Kasparov has played multiple times, because there's always these ideas of the e6 sacrifice where c7 can be taken for the e-pawn. But okay, king takes on d8, knight to c3, bishop to b4, a3. We're just going back. Knight to a4, takes, and bishop g5. So king c7 was played, and I decided to play h3. This is just a great move in these positions. It's always useful. Sometimes you want to play g4 and force their knight to go to an awkward square. And so it's just a solid move because of that. And here, a6 was played, which is an okay move. It doesn't really do much for the position at the moment, so I wouldn't really worry too much about that. It's just it's harder to find a plan because of what's going on here. But I would say maybe h6 would be best from them, where if I move off the diagonal, say bishop to f4, first off there is g5 with tempo, but even if we ignore that, now they can bring their pieces into the game. So instead, a6 was played. I guess they were just struggling to find the idea that they should really just remove this bishop from controlling the d8 square. And bishop to f4, so just getting out of any h6s. a5 and g4. So I really wanted to kick this knight away, and I gave them the e7 square, so that's exactly where they went. This wasn't an intentional thing, that's just what happened in the game. So I played knight to d4, however, and I was trying to go for this. I was trying to make sure that their bishop would have to move, or I would just get the bishop for the knight, and I would try to prove that my bishop is better than their knight, which is also a very interesting way to think here. The problem is if they move either here, so bishop d7 immediately loses because this is a check, so they have to deal with the check, and they're losing their bishop in the meantime. So we win a piece that is well worth it. But what happens if bishop c8? Why is this so bad? Well, because e6 is still very strong, and after king d8, because they can't go backwards and they can't go forward, so king d8 is the only move, we can take. And the problem is there's just a lot of issues in this position somehow, and it's kind of insane, because no matter what you really do, you just have to worry about non-stop pins, and there's always ideas like knight e6 if the bishop's ever like moved in any way. For example, even rook to f8, there should even be moves like this in the position, going bishop d6 followed by takes and a rook to d1, for example, and there's already threats of taking and knight to c6, and this is just a very uncomfortable position. So going back, e6, king d8, and then takes, and I believe knight to g6 is one of the best tries, where after bishop to g3, rook to f8, then we see the issue, f4 is coming, and if they take, then f5, and this is just very uncomfortable. But okay, regardless, now we've seen just some of the issues that can arise if they played bishop c8, so it's just not really the best idea for them in this position. Knight to d5, so they're just counterattacking my bishop. Of course, I can take their bishop with check, so that's what I do. And bishop to d2. So now they do have the worst structure. They do have this isolated e-pawn, and this does become an important feature in the position for the entire game, as we'll see. A takes b4, a takes b4. Then rook to a6. This makes a lot of sense. They just want me to take, and then they fix their structure. However, they do have the e6 pawn, but now they have one less weakness in the position. So instead, I don't take it, because if I were to take on a6, it just doesn't really make too much sense. I don't want to fix their structure in any way, so I just played c4, just controlling the square d5, so now they can't place their knight there anymore. And knight e7, I played b5 to attack their rook now. There's no rook a5 to go for the same idea, because the bishop does cover that square. Now we see rook a1, and rook d8. So they're controlling the open file, and I actually have a very strong move here, bishop to g5 after rook to d8, where no matter how you defend, I can pretty much just take. So rook e8, for example, takes, and rook a8. And I have a lot of activity here. It should be better for white. However, it's slight the advantage may be. Instead, I played bishop to e3, and I'm not really too sure why. I think the idea was maybe for a rook b1, as we will actually see. That's something that did occur in the game. Rook to d3 and rook b1. Now, here it doesn't really make too much sense, because they can just play rook to c3. And they can just trade off this pawn if they need to and win the c4 pawn. So it's not really like it's doing too much for me, unfortunately. For example, takes, king to c8, and this pawn should be lost. And if c5, then just knight to d5, for example. So the advantage is non-existent in this position. So instead, after rook to b1, c5, so now they close it down, and I go back to a1, and I'm trying to enter into the position with rook to a8. Knight to g6, and so I can't defend the pawn. But I had to have seen this, because it doesn't knight g6 just win the pawn. So I was very careful about this, and I saw actually they really can't take it. I played rook to a8. Now why can't they take the pawn? Well, they actually did. Knight takes e5, bishop to f4, rook to d1 check, king to g2, and rook to e1. Now that does defend it, and let's be clear here, for example, king to d6, they're not going to be losing the piece, because they can play king to e7 at the end of the day, so this just would not work, and they get out of the pin, and they're probably better here. So this is not something we want to allow. Instead, the whole point is after bishop to f4, king to d6, for example, we can really just go rook to a2 or to a1. And our whole idea is either we're going to go rook to e2 or we're going to go rook to d2 check, and we're winning the piece. So this would have been really nice to see king to d6. However, of course, this was not played. The rook to d1 check move was. And then they defended. So I played rook to g8. I'm not going to allow them to just get out of this pin because that's just completely out of theme for the position. We need to just keep the pin and use it for as long as we can, unless we can show that we have a huge advantage. So after h6, rook takes g7, king to c8. Now is the time to calculate, and I wanted to be very, very sure that I was winning here because, as many know, all rook endgames are drawn, as they say. So, am I winning? Now, it took a lot of calculation. I think I burned through 30 minutes of my clock here, but I came to the conclusion that bishop takes e5 was either near winning or winning, and there's no way black could win this position. Let's see how the game progressed. Rook takes e5, rook to g6, rook to e4, I take on h6, they take on c4, I take on e6. This all had to have been calculated, otherwise this is not something you'd want to go into if you're not sure, because, well, they do have their own passed pawn, and luckily, as we can see here, my pawns are much more advanced and much more easily advanceable than theirs. King to c7, g5, rook to h4, king to g3. Now I need to bring my king up and prepare the advancement of this pawn. Rook to h8, f4, rook to c8, g6, c4, rook to e3, king to d6. One thing that might be a little more accurate is just rook to e1, so I'm not wasting any tempos. But rook to e3 was played, and actually this is still winning. King to d6, rook to c3, king to c5, king to g4, king takes b5. Now they are able to advance all three of their pawns because they're not being stopped by anything. So this is a very scary position. King to g5, king b4, rook c1, king to b3, g7, c3, king to h6, c2, and king h7, king b2, rook g1, and it might look like, wait, isn't black just winning this game? The thing is, it's a little bit more complex than that, right? So when we get to this position, luckily this is winning, and I wanted to make sure about this way back here around this area. I wanted to just calculate as far as I could, and I did come to the conclusion that it should be winning. And it's not too difficult to calculate because it's a lot of just forced moves. There's only one move in the position, so it's just trying to make sure you hold the position in your head and you don't miscalculate. Luckily I didn't, and we go all the way through. So I sacrifice my rook for their pawn that just promoted to a queen, and they sacrifice their rook for my queen. Now in this position, you should definitely ask yourself, how would white win this? And it turns out that white is just up one move, just one move enough to win. And this is how. b5, f5, b4, f6, b3, f7, b2, f8 equals queen, b1 equals queen, and the whole point is you take on b1. And the issue here is they are stuck in front of their own pawn. So they are one move too short to actually promote here. h4, b5, h5, b4, h6, b3, h7, b2, I queen, they move out of the way, but unfortunately, as you may know, this is a winning position. And all you have to do when it's a knight pawn is check the king until the king goes in front of the pawn, and then after the king's in front of the pawn, you bring your king up. Now, I did not know the ideas of how to win this yet, but I had a general idea. Even though I've never seen this position before up to this point, it just looked like something that should be winnable. And luckily, I was right. However, if this was a knight pawn, I would have been wrong, and this is a draw, because there's a king to a1 resource where there's stalemate, but maybe for another day. Queen to h7, king to c1, queen to c7, king to d2, queen to a5, king to c2, queen to c5, king to d2, queen to d4, king to c2, queen to c4, king to d2, and the whole point, queen to b3. And we are attacking the pawn. They only have one move, and queen to c3 check. We're attacking the pawn and the king. They can no longer move away as we win the pawn, so they have to move in front. And now, since they have to move in front, we don't have to deliver a check because they can't promote on this move. So we bring the king up. And now you see the winning idea. We force the king to go in front of the pawn, and then we bring our king up, and then we can assist the king and the queen together to win the pawn. King to a2, queen to c2, king to a1, queen to a4, king b1, and king to e6. King to c1, queen c4, king d2, queen b3, king c1, queen c3, king b1, and king d5. King a2, queen c2, king a1, queen a4, king b1, king c4, king c1, queen a3, king c2, queen c3 check, king b1, king to b3, sorry, king to a1, and queen takes b2, checkmate. Now, that was kind of a wild ride, and I believe this is either my longest or my second longest game, and this was 86 moves long, so that was definitely a long one. However, there is one more that we should look at that might just be a little longer in the near future. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I thought this was a very interesting endgame, and this is definitely one of the prouder games that I've had. However, I did make many mistakes, and I got quite lucky as my opponent did not take advantage of these mistakes. For example, all the way back at the start, they really should have taken on c3, for example, giving up their bishop here, as I would have won it anyways, and now they have this very important c4 square with bishop to e6. And again, after bishop takes, these pawns are just quite weak, and they can be a target later on in the game. So regardless, now I am 2.5 out of 3 in this tournament, and this was a very fun game to play. It was a very long one, and being at the end of the day after 2 already pretty long games, I was drained and I needed some well-needed rest as I got. So regardless, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in game 4. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you then. Have a good one.